They set a plate in my honor. I'm not dead, I'm just stuck at work again. I got a message from Jerry that says, fuck you, I love you, man, how you been? I took 6 o'clock dinner time, shut the windows, close the blinds, head and book on, pillow lights out by 9. All for granted, busy being an asshole when we were all together. What am I gonna wait till everyone is dying to be together again? What am I gonna wait till everyone is dying to be together?
Welcome to the 3% podcast. This is Chad Post from Open Letter Books, and I am joined this week on our special 3% podcast by Valerie Miles, editor of the most recent Granta issue of the Best Spanish Language Novelists, and a translator, an editor, a literary citizen extraordinaire. I'm not sure what other titles to give you.
I think that's good.
That's good enough.
I think that's enough.
Well, thank you for coming on to do this. So I just to frame.
Thank you for having me.
It was 11 years ago, actually, right? It was 2010 that the first Granta Best Spanish Language Novelist collection came out. And we did a bunch of promotions for it on 3%, including featuring each one of the authors, some of whom we ended up publishing. You mentioned beforehand Samantha Schweblin, whose first short story that appeared in English outside of Granta was in one of our anthologies.
Wow.
But then we did Carlos Labe, Andres Newman, and we're involved with like a bunch of the other authors from there. And it was a great experience to like read everything and to write about it. So now that you have a new one, 10 years, basically a decade later, we're hoping to do a lot of promotions on the website again throughout this month, and thought that it'd be great to kick things off by talking to you just about the general process, about what the issue is trying to do, about any sort of trends that you found within it, all that kind of fun stuff. So I guess the real question is, I guess a good starting point would be, how are things different for this issue versus the first time that you did it?
Oh, well, kind of like there's this thing called a pandemic. I don't know if you've heard of it. Tiny little thing called a pandemic. Yes, that's really one of the big differences, but there are others because, of course, the first in 2010, life changes so quickly. We forget how quickly things have changed. And in 2010, we were still, people were sending us their books because we only select writers who have been published at least once or have a contract to be published. So people were sending us their books. So, we we needed a lot of space to put all of the books that we were receiving and all of that physical, side of reading. And since we were in the middle of the pandemic, it was impossible to depend on, the mail. So we didn't know if we were going to be able to get our mail. So we had to very quickly react. And luckily, a good friend named Angel Fernandez, he helped us did everything digital so that we could launch the call for candidates online. So that's one of the really big differences. And also, since Granta, Granta started, the Spanish edition of Granta started in 2003. And it was back when we were still working with Ray Hederman and Ian Jack in New York Review of Books. And then Sigrid took over Granta. And when Sigrid came on in 2005, actually 2006 is when we started working with her. She really encouraged us a lot. And before then, we always had this dream that someday we would do one of the famous Granta lists, but we didn't know if it would be viable. But when Sigrid came around, she kind of really let us know that it would be a viable thing to do. And her encouragement was really important for us to do that. So we didn't know a lot. I mean, it was the first time that we were doing it. So we had to kind of break our own ice, get to know how to do something like this. It's a very big, proposition to put forward. And neither did everybody know us as well as they do now. That first list, we had to do a lot of prospecting to explain to people what Granta's lists are. So that was a big difference. We worked very hard to do that. With the second list, since that first list was, rather successful, we didn't have to do so much prospecting because people already know perfectly well what the list is. They know that they want to be on the list.
Mhm.
And so we, luckily in the pandemic, when we weren't able to move around so much, we were still able to get a very good selection of people for the second list. And there was a lot of expectation for this second list.
It's interesting. I like the numbers that you have in here that you get 229 nominations the first time, but like most of them were men, like 2/3 of them were men, 163 to 65, and that this time there was 112 by men and 82 by women, so much closer balance to it, which is something you talk about in your introduction in terms of like the female writers that make the list and this kind of new generation of interesting writers that are coming about. I didn't want to jump right to that, but why not? What do you think about the list as like the trends and the sort of structure of it this time?
Let's see. So yes, definitely, a lot has changed in that too. And the list reflects a lot of those changes, also in the Spanish language that have been going on. And we did ask ourselves that question, like what was, if there was, after the Me Too and all the glass shattering, is that going to be reflected in any way on the list? And it was definitely reflected. This time of 25 writers, there's 11 female writers. So there's more than double the first time. There are more writers also. But what is the interesting thing, I think, here is that we saw that the majority of the candidates who were born in the 90s were women writers. So that means that there is a wave coming. The younger ones, that were putting themselves forward are the women. So you can see that that generation is coming, and we had to make a lot of decisions. For example, it's 35 and below, and it would have been very easy just to go to like the 35-year-olds who have emerged a little bit earlier and had a little bit more time to work on their books, have more books under their belt, their names are more kind of recognized maybe, and not do the kind of prospecting that we think is part of our job as a Granta, for a Granta selection. So we decided to follow hunches, to allow ourselves to, pay a lot of attention to also the ones that are a little bit younger. And for example, the youngest person on the list, who is Irene Reyes Noguerol, who is a Spanish writer, she was born in 1997. She's only 23 years old. And the difference between her and the oldest person on the list, who's 35 years old, is 12 years. And so you say, like, that's half of her life.
Yeah.
It's like, do you realize that? Like, we're talking about people who are that young, but the women in the issue, anyone who reads the issue is going to find, are powerful voices, powerful. There's a kind of urgency and an energy there, like, like almost like somebody who takes a rubber band and pulls it back and doesn't let it go, and all of a sudden that rubber band's let go, and it's like, whew. That's the writing. When Cristina Morales, that's her voice is absolutely extraordinary. Then when you have like Danaides Machado, the Cuban writer, she's very funny, and her characterization is like right on. She's so on character. It's amazing. And then you have a writer like Aura Garcia Junco, who's from Mexico, who is wildly, she reminds me a little bit of Labe, actually, extremely experimental, using a lot of meta resources in order to tell a story about like the disappearances in Mexico. Very, very, very interesting. So the women writers, what I can tell you about the women writers on this list is like, they're hot. They're great. And nobody could read them and say, oh, you know, you made concessions. Like, there's no way. No way on earth. They're great, great, great writers.
That was one of the other things. So that seems very interesting to me. But the other thing that you mentioned in the intro that demographically sounded interesting was where the different writers were from this time, and that it was more the balance was different. I'm gonna find it here, but do you want to talk about that for a second of how that got? Oh, here it is. Yeah, so 6 from Spain, 4 from Mexico, 3 from Argentina, 3 from Cuba, 2 from Chile, 1 from Colombia, Ecuador, Equatorial Guinea, Nicaragua, Peru, and Uruguay, and 1 who's from Costa Rica and Puerto Rico, which is whatchamacallit, like on his name, which Carlos Fonseca, right?
Yes, from Puerto Rico.
Yeah,
and Costa Rica.
Costa Rica.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So
yes, there were a lot of changes. Yeah.
Well, and the first,
for example, there were 8 countries represented in the first list.
Okay. And this time there's more than 8.
And now there are 13. Yeah, there are 13. So it's a much wider list. And we even have a writer from Equatorial Guinea. So it's now 4 continents, not only 3, because there's an African writer on the list. And the big change has been kind of these centers of power that people like to call them, which is kind of a really dubious way of calling them that. But anyway, Spain, that had 7 writers on the first list, lost a writer, and Argentina lost 4 writers. Who also had 7 on the list, depending on, because Andres Newman, is he Spanish or is he Argentine? That's that's one of the questions. A little bit like Carlos Fonseca on this list. Is he Puerto Rican or is he Costa Rican? Well, he considers himself both.
Right.
So Argentina also kind of lost some writers, but this year, for some strange reason, the Argentine, we didn't receive as many writers from Argentina as in the year before. There were substantially less candidates, which sometimes, we choose from what we receive. So for some, so there are writers from, it's a much broader list. There are not only more women, there are more writers of color. There are more indigenous writers. There's people, it's just a much more diverse list. People from a lot of different places. And not only that, they're not from like the cities. A lot of the writers, even in Argentina, either they're not from Buenos Aires or they don't write about Buenos Aires. The same in Colombia, the writer's not even from Medellin. He's from a small town on the coast. He lives in Medellin now, but he's from a small town on the coast. Even in Spain, one writer's from Madrid and one, but not really. He's really from Mallorca, not from Madrid. And one writer is from Barcelona, but most of them live in Granada and Sevilla and the Canary Islands. So they're not in the kind of like the traditional places that we expect writers to come from in the Spanish language, which for us was very, very exciting. And you can notice it in their writing quite a bit. In this issue, it's very clear. They're writing about places. One of the things that I thought was really interesting is that they're bringing us news from places we don't know much about. And they're telling us, they're making us interested in things that we didn't know we were interested in. And for me, that's a real example of when writing, what great writing.
That's really exciting. That was one of the things that you did mention too that really piqued my interest is talking about if there's one sort of like thread that runs throughout the selections is that they're all like voice driven and that there's a strong sense of voice. And that's something that I've always particularly been drawn to for books I like to read or publish or whatever. So I was very intrigued by that. And I wonder, you sort of reflect on it a bit in your introduction, but I'm curious like how you would say that, how you would describe it. Describe that bias, that
well, let's see. I could tell you, for example, like you said, there are 3 Cubans on the list. That's one of the big differences because there were no Cubans on the list last time. And so all of a sudden, that's one of the big differences. There's this eruption, of this generation of Cuban writers. And, Cuba's a little bit been off Broadway, we could say, in the Spanish language, as far as kind of literary culture is concerned. So it's very, very exciting to see them kind of incorporating anew into the Spanish conversation, literary conversation. And these are writers whose voices are very particularly Cuban, in the sense that Daenerys Machado, for example, talks about Guillermo Cabrera Infante, who's anyone who's read Guillermo knows he's a voice-driven writer. She talks about him as like part of her inspiration, right? And you can completely hear him, there. When you read these Cuban writers, it's impossible not to read in Cuban and have a Cuban accent as you're reading. It's impossible. And the Cuban accent is a beautiful accent. It's a lot of fun. And these writers are writing, at least Daenerys and Idris Planche Sabon. The 2 of them are writing in a very humorous. They use a lot of humor. Which is also extremely refreshing. When we started reading them, the whole jury kind of like breathed, we could breathe again in the pandemic, in the middle of this, like the darkness. And all of a sudden we're reading these 2 Cuban writers who are just making us feel joy. Their use of language is joyful, even though what they're writing is not always joyful.
Right.
But it's that they have that wonderful paradox of writing about things that might, be very stirring in one way, but yet using a language that is joyful at the same time. And that paradox is lovely. And then also Carlos Manuel Alvarez, who is the 3rd Cuban. What's interesting also is that there's, Carlos Manuel has a little bit more of a conflicted relationship with the island. So he lives between New York, Miami, DF, and Havana, kind of going back and forth. But Daenerys is actually one of the first students to receive a visa to come to the United States to study. So she's in Miami, studying in the University of Miami, just as a regular student, not as a refugee, not as an exile, not as anything. So anything untoward. She's just a student. And so it's really lovely to see, and it's really interesting because Eudris is from Guantanamo. Also, his family is from Guantanamo. So here we have a writer, and he ventriloquizes. Can you say that in Spanish, in English? Yes, ventriloquizes or ventriloquates, whatever it is. The British tradition, actually. Catherine Mansfield in The Garden Party, one of her kind of novellas. So it's very funny to see a Cuban writer who couldn't be farther away from that tradition. But isn't that lovely? Because that's literature, because he can read it and he engage with it. And as far as other voices, what I can say is all you have to do is listen to Monica Ojeda writing about Inti Raymi, which is the festival, Incan Festival of the Sun, and it's about the people dance. It's a ecstatic dancing, and they dance until they drop, and you can hear in her sentences the dancing. And by the end of the story, you feel like you're in the ecstasy of an Inti Raymi dance, because just by your tongue has been dancing the same way that they dance. Or Jose Ardila, who is the Colombian writer who writes about Juancho Baile, It's called Dance Juancho. And it's also set on the coast in Colombia. And it has these kind of melodies, the melodic coastal sound of the way that Spanish is spoken there. And it's about a kind of a village idiot who has some kind of strange reaction to when somebody tells him to dance. And he makes this response and he starts to dance. And so you can also, it's like, again, you hear the sounds of the dancing almost in the language itself. And then of course you have Paulina Flores from Chile, who introduces us. Her piece is very self-conscious. It knows that it's a piece of writing all the time, right? So her character, first we get to meet the character. We don't really understand some of these words. And then all of a sudden the narrator explains to us so that we can understand what Buddha, in the name of the character is Buddha, is talking about, no? Wow. So we're slowly but surely being like pulled into the story, all these different levels of the story being told. It's very clever. She's a very clever writer. Yes.
Yeah, so there's going to be a lot of fun going through this and reading all of these and writing them and digesting them. And I don't think we alluded to this yet, but we're going to come back in a few weeks and have a larger conversation about a lot of the pieces in more depth. So this as a good preview, and then we'll be able to get into more of it later. One thing that I was told to ask you about, and that you noted in your introduction, which I think is interesting, is that this time compared to the first round, in the Spanish version, you included the bylines for all the translators that worked on it for the English version. Can you talk about that as to like the motivation behind that and the interest in doing so?
Yes, well, because we were very careful about the pairing of the translators with the writers. And this, I guess this is where, luckily I had the chance, and it's a little bit unusual to be the editor of the Spanish edition and the editor of the English edition. Right. So, so I know the Spanish very well. I worked with all of the writers, some of them quite a bit, to prepare the Spanish material. And so, I also know a lot of these translators, their work. I know who they've translated. I know how they translate. And so I tried to put them together and pair them, knowing a little bit of the styles and such. And so to me, that I am also a translator and know the work of the translator, I do not want translators to be invisible. And even though the translators are not in, their work doesn't exist in the Spanish because it's the original version, they're still a part of the writer's project, because once we translated, there are still things in the translation, any translator knows, there are still things in the translation that you can miss. And so translators are often also partly editors. And, I had long discussions with the translators. The writers had discussions with the translators. And as a result, also, there's like a ping pong from the translators into the original Spanish. And so we could do that kind of work. Since I was kind of like that lever in between both of them, we could ping back, and I could rework with the writer the original based on something that a translator found or a suggestion by a translator, because what we want is for these pieces to be the best possible pieces when they're finished, right? Yeah. So that work, I feel, needs to be recognized. And so that's why we wanted to make sure that all of the translators got bylines also in the Spanish, because even though you don't notice it, they are a part of that piece.
Right. That's excellent. That's really cool that you're able to do that, and to put it in that way makes a lot of sense to me. It seems.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely does.
Very good. So I don't know is there anything else that you wanted to talk about in relationship to the issue to set this up for our month of Granta celebrations? Oh, I know something. Can you tell us, this should go live on Thursday, May 6th, which events might be taking place that people might be interested in knowing about? since now everything's virtual, I assume, so we can all attend everything.
Yes, it is virtual. So far. Hopefully pretty soon we'll have other ones that are not. But we have, tomorrow we'll be at Harvard at 1:30 p.m. We'll be with Michel Nieva from Argentina, with Denaides Machado from Cuba. And the third person we're going to be with is Mateo Garcia Elizondo from Mexico. Yeah. So that'll be the Harvard event. And then on the 12th, we'll be at King's College. And we're going to be with Martin Felipe Castagnet from Argentina and Miluska Benavides from Peru. Mm-hmm. And then on the 20th, we'll be at the Brooklyn Library with Monica Ojeda from Ecuador. And Miluska will also be with us there. And Mateo Garcia Elizondo will also be there. So those are the kind of close up ones. We'll be at the Hay Festival also in Wales with Irene Reyes Nogarol, Andrea Abreu, and Cristina Morales. So, and there are plenty more, that are being arranged slowly but surely. I can say that it's been just such an it's been the experience of my life to work on this. I have, I kind of laugh with the writers because it was very difficult. We have to keep this quiet for a very, very long time. The writers, they were first selected, and this might be interesting to talk about quickly. They were first selected in July, the end of July.
Wow.
But they were like pre-selected. Then they had to deliver a piece, and the piece had to pass muster in order to be a part of the selection, the final selection.
Right.
So then the writers had until October to deliver a piece. So, they had to be quiet about being pre-selected as they were, under the pressure and the tension of having to produce a piece for the issue. That's why I call it a music of chance.
Yeah.
Because, some writers, of course, were working on things, some writers were not. So all of them had to come up with something in this period of time, that was in some way representative of their poetics. Yeah. And at the same time, good enough for the issue. So then I worked with them until like November, December, and then we gave them to the translators, and then we continued working. Then it was incorporating 25 translators. Well, actually 23, because Megan McDowell has 3 writers on the list.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So then we incorporated all of them. They also had to be quiet and keep it quiet. And then we incorporated 25 voices, because there's an audible edition of the original Spanish. And so 25 voices. And I helped also choose the voices so that they would coincide, since this is such a musical piece, such a musical issue with all of these writers using language and using sound in it. It's the sonant qualities of language in such a way that we really had to have the voices, be able to pick that up. So I had to, we had to find the voices from all of these different countries, even Equatorial Guinea. And we found one who read absolutely gorgeous piece by Estanislao Medina Huesca. And so I ended up having the whole orchestra of people that, I had to keep the news from sneaking out,
Yeah.
So that was that, I kind of felt like Inspector Clouseau for a little while. Have you said anything to anybody?
I was going to say, you're sort of like J.K. Rowling of Spanish.
Yeah, totally. So the writers, they all kind of, now we all laugh, and I like say their names with like joy in public, But that was a very kind of unusual part of the whole thing.
I mean, I guess it's good that there was no that there are no like book parties for people to go get drunk at.
I know, and then it just like sneak out. I didn't think about that, but you're actually right.
You're like, pandemic is bad in one way, very good in another.
Very good in another. But it's lovely now to have the chance to see them, and they're getting to meet each other, and also some of the what I call the emeritus writers from the 2010 list are getting to know some of the younger writers, and it's really a lot of fun. And also, I think it's very important to realize in the introduction, I also mention a lot of the writers who came close to being on the list. Making a list, of course, is an arbitrary thing. If it were a different jury, it would probably be a different list, probably not a largely different list, but it would be, a little bit different. And so part of it is like, being on a jury is like playing the the Ouija board. No, it's like you kind of move around here, you move around there, and then when it stops, it's on a yes or a no. And we, we as a jury, I think we made very good choices, but we all had to give up, writers whose work we really liked. Yeah. So I was very careful to at least put some of those names in the introduction. And part of the thing, Rodrigo Frisson said the other day, he's like, but part of the fun is being on the anti-list, because that's like more fun. It's like everybody wants to be on the anti-Nobel, right? Well, the anti-Granta list, people are getting together now, and and so it gives everybody a chance to say the names of other writers who are really, really good. And there's writers that have already come up afterwards that we would have loved to have been able to consider. Other writers who just didn't, for some reason didn't send their things in, and we weren't able to consider. Right. But it just shows this, and also 10 of 30, which very well. Yep. Which Katie Whitmore is translating with other people, but she's the principal translator, and Javier Serena is taking care of. These things just show that there's a lot going on in the language. And one of the things I like to say when people ask me, I just say, what? The one thing I learned is the kids are fine. They're going to be okay.
Yeah, very true.
They're fine. They're like no addled brains here, like the attention span stuff. No, they're like really good writers coming out in this language. Really good ones.
There's a moment in your introduction where I think you're channeling Rodrigo, where specifically as I am 500 pages deep into the remembered part, there's a line that says, things that are familiar made stranger re-enchanted. Writers like the ones who came before, the ones who didn't know about Instagram, writers who are not readers but rereaders. The number of times rereading is mentioned in Rodrigo's trilogy is like astronomical. I saw that, and like the no Instagram rereading is like, that is great.
Absolutely. Rodrigo, was absolutely one of the, kind of the key in this process, because as he reads everything. I mean, there's like absolutely nobody who has read as much as Rodrigo has read and retained, because one thing is reading, another thing is retaining it. Yeah. And he's, Rodrigo's a genius. Yeah. And having him on the jury was very important, because not only is he a genius, but he is also, he has a good idea of what he likes, and he holds the bar high. Yeah. And he was, I mean, when I write in the introduction, that we said yes, we said no, we said over my dead body. Well, that was Rodrigo.
I wondered if that was that's, I could hear him voice that phrase.
Yes.
The thing that would be fun is like the ones that to create a list of the authors who didn't qualify, that fell between the two, like didn't have a book out at the one are too old the second time. Like, I don't know if this
Right.
is, but you referenced Juan Gomez Barcena, who are publishing next
Yes.
fall. And I know he was like
Yes.
2 weeks off. He's 2 weeks too old, but I don't know if he had a book published prior to the last selection period.
No, he didn't.
So he would be
didn't.
one of those that's gap, like in that gap, which is interesting.
In the gap. And we were very sorry about that. We
Yeah,
were
there's-
very sorry about that. He's an excellent writer, and
Yeah,
I'm very glad that you're publishing him.
He's wonderful. He's amazing.
He
But yeah,
is.
there's those people.
He
It's
is.
interesting because there is that constraint, and those constraints aren't. None of this is like you say,
Exactly.
you're making a list. You are making a list out of a set of constraints, and one of them being that.
Exactly.
And that.
Voila. Because also another one was Valeria Luiselli, who we couldn't publish, we couldn't add because she only had nonfiction
Yes.
before the list. And we don't, this is for fiction. These are fiction writers. And so we couldn't, she couldn't be considered because she didn't have any fiction.
Yeah.
And very shortly afterwards, she came out with her novel. And so it's bound to happen, and some writers emerge later than other writers. Not all writers start at before 35. There are plenty of writers who come along and write, and there are other writers like, for example, Emiliano Monge, who what he had sent in didn't quite meet it, and we all kind of thought, oh my gosh, why didn't you send that in?
Yeah.
So there are a lot of writers that and sometimes you say maybe some of the writers who didn't make it on the list will be so angry they're going to write like really killer things now because they're angry.
Yeah.
So it can also help.
Be a motivator. I could imagine Rodrigo creating a list of like authors who debut over the age of 40 and imagining what books they would have written had they started younger. That being a list.
That would be a very.
I might actually
very
steal
creative.
that from him.
There you go.
Oh man, well, I don't have anything else to ask you. I'm just really excited to actually start reading all of these one by one now that my classes are over. I'm done reading.
Because I really want people to read because it's really good.
Yeah.
I mean, I can say Halation, which is actually, I think, longer than most of the texts, but I can really say these are really great texts. They're really good writers.
Yeah.
I think we raised the bar from the 2010 list. I'm sorry, but there's some really good writing here.
That's great. It's great. It's exciting to know that that's what's coming ahead for the next month. So stay tuned, check in with the podcast, check in with the website as well. And you'll get a lot of information about all of these writers. And you can pick up your issue of Granta anywhere magazines are sold essentially, or ordered online through Granta's website. Is there an ebook version of Granta?
There will be one.
Okay.
It's on its way.
Okay.
It's on its way. And the Spanish edition is out. I should also mention that the Spanish edition in the US is going to be done by Vintage, and it will be out on the 29th of May.
Oh, excellent.
For those who want to have, both editions for people who study translation or people who are studying Spanish and would like to have both of the editions. The Spanish language version in the US will be done by Vintage, and it's out on the 29th of May.
I'm going to get that. I'd like to look at both of them just to see. So very cool. And congratulations again on another great list, another successful launch. And I'm sure we'll be in touch again shortly.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And I really want to thank also the team at Granta, Luke Nima and Eleanor Chandler, and all of the great people that I worked with, because it was an extraordinary experience to work with them. Usually they're in the British Granta and I'm in the Spanish Granta, and this time I had a chance to work with them, and it was wonderful. And so I really want to thank them and thank Sigrid for encouraging us to do this.
Excellent. Well,
Thank you, Chad, for having me.
Oh, of course. And stay safe.
They set a plate in my honor. I'm not dead, I just got off the internet. internet. I got a postcard from my past self that read, if you're alive, welcome home, it's all how you left it. If you're alive, welcome home, it's all how you left it. It's all how you left it. Now eat before it gets cold.